Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unworthy History. Here on this channel, we try to talk about actual history that isn't covered by the History Channel. And one thing they don't cover is history of the war between Texas and Indians throughout much of the 1800s. So today, I'm going to bring you another story from this book right here. This is called Indian Depredations in Texas by J.W. Wilbarger, published back in the 1880s. So this story comes from Lavaca County. Lavaca County is where I had some ancestors, John and Margaret Hallett, and they founded Hallettsville, which is still around today. So it's interesting to me because of that aspect. But another reason why it's interesting is that this W.P. Brashear, who I'm going to read about, he was actually quite a character, and he sort of had this carefree attitude. He wasn't, really scared at all. He was really cool, calm, and collected. And he also sort of taunted the Indians as they were trying to kill him. So I hope you'll enjoy this next story here. Some very remarkable escapes have been made from Indians in Texas, of which I will mention one or two instances. Mr. Brashear was one of the very few men I have met in my life who never took any precautions against danger, and yet was perfectly cool and collected when danger came. I do not believe he ever felt the sensation of fear. He had a brother killed at Fannon's massacre, and in consequence, he entertained the most inveterate hatred towards the Mexicans and especially for Santa Anna. After the Battle of San Jacinto, and while Santa Anna was a prisoner at Velasco, Brashear went there, as he told me himself, for the express purpose of shooting him on sight. But General Houston, in anticipation of some such attempt upon life of his illustrious prisoner, had him surrounded constantly with a strong guard, whose orders were that no one with arms should have access to him. Consequently, when Brashear applied for permission to see him, he was searched, and the pistol with which he intended to revenge the death of his brother was found upon his person, and his request to see Santa Anna being refused, he remained at Velasco until Santa Anna left for the States, hoping by some means to get a pop at him, but the opportunity never occurred. In 1839, Brashear went to Lavaca County for the purpose of locating lands, and whilst there, he boarded at the house of a gentleman named by the name of Hensley, who resided at one of the extreme frontier settlements. Although that section of country was frequently visited by marauding bands of Indians, Brashear would often, in spite of Hensley's warnings, go out alone and unarmed to examine lands 10, 15, or 20 miles from the settlement. Whenever Hensley told him he ran a great risk of having his hair lifted in riding about the country alone, his reply invariably was that he had no fear, as there was not an Indian in Texas who could catch him when mounted on "Get Out," as he called his half-breed Mexican horse. One morning he left Hensley's with the intention of examining a tract of land about 10 miles west of the settlement, and as usual he had no arms with him more formidable than a pocket knife. He reached the locality he wished to examine, and was busily engaged in tracing a line with a pocket compass, when on turning a point of post oak timber, he discovered about 20 Comanche warriors mounted upon their Mustang ponies, not more than a quarter-mile distant. As soon as the Indians saw him, they gave the war whoop and came swooping down upon him. Brashear instantly wheeled his horse and started towards the settlement. The Indians followed him, and yelling and whooping like so many devils. Brashear said he was not at all frightened, although he was unarmed, as he felt confident that Get Out could easily run away from the Indians on their ponies. But to his astonishment, before he had gone a mile, he found the Indians were gaining upon him, and if something was not done, and that pretty quickly, they would overtake him long before he could reach the Hensley settlement. About a mile ahead of him, he knew there was a creek called Boggy, which could only be crossed at a few localities. He therefore determined to push Get Out to his utmost speed until he struck Boggy Creek, 600 or 700 yards below a crossing, and as soon as he had hid from view by the skirt of timber bordering the creek, to make a crossing and get back as quickly as possible to the point where he had entered the timber. He therefore plied whip and spurs to Get Out, in order to carry his plan into execution, and soon had the satisfaction of seeing that he was rapidly forging ahead of the Indians. The moment he struck the timber on boggy and his movements could not be seen by the Indians, he made for the ford, crossed it, and galloped down the creek until he supposed he was about opposite the place where the Indians had lost sight of him. He had hardly reached this point when he called the Indians, and they made their appearance, and seeing Brashear going off in a direct line, they naturally concluded he had crossed at that place. Without halting for a moment, they plunged into the creek, and instantly their horses went down into their necks in the treacherous quicksand. While the Indians were vainly endeavoring to extricate their horses from the bog, Brashear said he could not resist the inclination to crow over them a little, which he did by some very expressive pantomime. This made the Indians furious, and one or two who had scrambled out of the bog on foot commenced shooting at him, whereupon Brashear bid them adieu, and rode off leisurely, as he knew it would take some time to extricate their horses from the embraces of old Boggy. On another occasion, Brashear had a very close call from Indians while out hunting. He had just killed a deer and had dismounted from his pony for the purpose of butchering it. He was in an act of doing so when he discovered a party of Indians half a mile distant coming towards him on their ponies at full speed. Leaving his deer to be butchered at a more convenient opportunity, he hastily mounted his pony — he was not riding the redoubtable Get Out on that occasion — and started towards home, but he soon found the Indians were rapidly overhauling him. About half a mile ahead there was a considerable elevation on the prairie, covered in places with a thick growth of chaparral, and Brashear made for it with all the speed he could get out of his pony, with whip and spur. As soon as he had entered the chaparral and was hid from the view of his pursuers, he hastily dismounted, tied his pony to a bush, and continued his retreat on foot. His idea was, when the Indians came up and discovered his pony, they would naturally conclude he was secreted somewhere in the vicinity, and that before they found out their mistake, he would have had sufficient time to make his. His plan worked admirably, and Brashear reached the settlement without seeing anything more of the Indians. The next morning, in company with 5 or 6 men from the settlement, he went to the place where he had left his pony and found him still there. It was evident, as Brashear had anticipated, that the Indians, when they came up and discovered the pony, supposed that his rider was concealed nearby, and knowing that he was armed, they had not dared to venture within gunshot. So that was a few stories about this fella named W.P. Brashear. First, he tried to kill Santa Anna by sneaking a pistol into his tent where he was being held at Velasco, and then he even tried to follow him throughout the rest of the U.S. And then he had the incident where he went out alone, unarmed, 10 or 20 miles from the settlements, and he was followed and pursued by a band of Indians. And then he had the insight to basically get them stuck in Boggy Creek. And then finally he had that other incident where he evaded the Indians by tricking them really once again. So maybe this W.P. Brashear was correct, that he didn't need to be armed because he could just outrun or outsmart his pursuers. So that's the end of this episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time here on Unworthy History.